I can't hear you.
Revolutionary product. It's Cool Cousin's new lager. And to discuss why it's possibly revolutionary, I have with me the founder here of John Midgley. No, not the founder of John Midgley, but John Midgley, the founder of Cool Cousin. And John, first, thanks for joining me. But the whole idea behind the Cool Cousin beer is that it's a commercial beer that doesn't malt the grain.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, I'm sure you've got some interesting responses to all of that, but maybe because you're not the first to do this, but you're the first to do it, I think, you're not the first person to produce beers that haven't had malted grain in them, but you're the first to kind of make it a big thing and the focus of your brewery. So maybe we should just talk first about how you got to this stage. What led you to the stage where you're setting up this kind of beer that's going to try and change the industry?
I mean, it was, as I suppose a lot of these things, a bit of an accident. It was COVID. I was scratching around for a change of career, something new to do, more generally. And I don't know, I forget why, but I came across a good friend of mine who was starting a distillery. We got talking, and for some reason that just sparked an idea of doing a crafted lager. I felt, in my area in Brooklyn, there were 42, 47, craft breweries, and they were great. They were exciting. They were fun. They were dynamic. They were creative. But the beer that was mostly being made and served was craft IPAs, and I just I don't know why. I can't take a lot of bitterness. I didn't like the IPAs at all. Never did. Always liked German beers. And I felt, for me there was a disconnect. It's like you had the craft industry, exciting, dynamic. For me, I couldn't drink it. And then you had macro traditional lagers. To me, they felt just like big corporations. They were 100-year-old plus companies that people who were working there had no connection to brewing anymore. So they just felt like a Unilever type brands, sort of generic. And I felt, okay, well, there's a space there between those two of creating a really, why not create a really beautifully handcrafted lager style beer, Pilsner lager, whatever, those German style beers. And that was the kernel of the idea. And then from there, I realized, okay, if I'm going to do this, I had to know how to brew. I've never brewed in my life. I did one home brew. That was it. And so I went online, found some courses, and there was this one course that piqued my interest. It was the Science of Brewing from the University of Leuven in Belgium.
Yeah.
And started that, had lots of videos. It was, you do it on your own, you go through the different sections, there's all these videos. It was, very easy it was easy to do, but to understand, I've been a photographer my whole career. I was always interested in science, and I geek out and nerd out a lot on Wikipedia and New York Times, but I'm by no means a scientist or a biologist or a chemist. So I was floundering, we're having to Google search what all these terms meant. But I just decided, we'll just plow through it and get to the end. And then you can always go back and do it again. So did that. And what came out of it was a good basic understanding of the science of brewing. But more importantly, they kept talking about sustainability. And sustainability had made huge leaps and bounds in terms of recycling of water, less water usage, for the overall brewery. But the one place that they highlighted constantly and repeatedly that had not made any real tangible improvements was malting. And in the course, they were hinting continuously that there must be a better way than using malt. And there was a thing called green malt that they talked about, which is wet, undried malt to save the energy of drying. But it still went through the malting. It still went through the water process. And I did some research on that. The beer tasted, from everything I could see on the research, it tasted horrible, and it was hard to work with. The mashes were getting stuck. There was it was a difficult process. And then just 2 weeks of noodling around the internet, I found these enzyme cocktails that exist. They're manufactured. You can buy them online and you can brew with them. But with a bit more research, I couldn't find any recipes for the beer, and all the research that I was looking at about this type of technology suggested that the end result of all these academic papers was the beer tastes like shit. It's colorless, it's tasteless, but it's got alcohol. And that's it. But there wasn't much follow up either. There was no like secondary article. There was no group, threads or talks. It was just really weird. So I took this information to my cousin who had worked at Diageo doing mergers and acquisitions for a long time. And we bounced the idea around. He was very intrigued. He'd walked away from Diageo and he'd walked away from the drinks world and wanted to get back. He had a little bit of capital. He wanted to do a startup. So we got talking, and the conclusion that we both came to was that the big macro breweries, AB InBev, Heineken, all of them were using enzymes. And actually, one of the research papers that I read about the exo energy usage or the exo energy profile of brewing with and without malt was actually sponsored by Heineken in 2008. So they knew about this. Not only did they know about it, they were looking into it very actively. And then we looked at other news articles and other research, and it seemed like what was happening. So one thing that happened around that time, I think it was Coors Miller Lite, or maybe it was AB InBev, someone in Eastern Europe, and I think it might have been Lithuania, a journalist did a sort of, an undercover piece about, big breweries using biotech to produce shitty beer and dumping it on these poor Eastern European people. It was a hack job of an article, and but it was sensationalist, And so my theory was there was two things. Also, around this time, around 2008, 2009, there's the crash, so they can't invest in new things. But also, just before this, craft brewery was really surging and continued to surge after 2008. And it was eating the lunch of the big macro breweries, so Heineken, everyone. They were getting their asses whooped. And they decided to double down and become, we are craft, right? So Heineken, AB InBev, we're a family of, who've been brewing for over 100 years, and we are a malt beverage company. So clearly making a standpoint that they are not biotech, and they were clearly spooked by this biotech article, even though it didn't gain much traction, it wasn't very big. It freaked them out. So and that in combination with seeing what craft breweries are doing, say, okay, we are part of craft. We are the original craft in a way. And so with that, I also realized when I looked back at GM, the way that GM launched an electric car in the 1980s, maybe 1981, they had an electric car. It was a great electric car. Ford had an electric car in 1904, I think, really early on, almost one of the first cars they did was electric. So electric cars have been around for a long time, and GM made a push and then quickly pulled it away. And a lot of the press coverage was that this was the fuel lobbyists, the fuel industry lobbying to shut it down, and how dirty and how filthy this whole thing was. And that may or may not have happened, but we felt the real reason was actually probably even simpler. It was strategic. If GM was to say, okay, shouting from the rooftops, electric cars are the way forwards, this is the new technology, it's clean and it's efficient, suddenly the customers who are buying $20 billion worth of petrol cars every year are going to turn around and say, well, what's this piece of crap I'm driving? So GM couldn't do but two things at the same time. They could not be electric and petrol at the same time. They had to choose. And so they knew if they went electric, they weren't quite ready to they wouldn't be up to speed quickly enough to say, okay, we're going to get rid of $20 billion worth of income. They just couldn't. There's no strategic way anyone would have let them do that. So they shut down the electric car very quickly. And so we feel with all those same sort of strategic factors in play, AB InBev, Heineken could not suddenly pivot and become tech sustainability brand. They just couldn't. Okay. So we realized, okay, and also those brands are Titanics. They're huge. They're oil tankers. They can't turn on a dime and from one day to the next do something different. It takes them a long time. So we realized, okay, there's a space here like Tesla. We don't own the copyright to enzymes. We don't own the copyright to these particular enzymes. And like with Tesla, we didn't invent the batteries or the electric engine. We're just going to be the first company to use it and popularize it. We can scream from every rooftop that this is the way forwards.
Yeah,
you know,
it
because
makes
we've got,
sense. You're not killing your existing market because you don't have
no,
one. So,
no, we have nothing to lose. In fact, quite the opposite. This is our,
yeah, your unique advantage, sort of.
yeah,
Okay, so then you went. So okay, so you decided on that. You decided this was the way you were going. You decided on your marketing and that this was something you were going to push. How did you get from that idea into like actually commercially producing the beer?
yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. So yeah, after that conversation with that cousin who lives in London and who, didn't have the space to brew, he said, "Oh yeah, you're going to have to start. Someone's going to start brewing this, because I'm about to have a small baby." So I was like, "Okay." So I bought a whole house full of home brewing equipment from SS Brewtech. They had this really nice, very sophisticated,
Okay.
pretty professional brewing equipment for home brewing. So never having brewed, I'm jumping in there with glycol chillers and temperature controlling systems and mash tuns and boil tuns. I don't even know what that means. And I'm building this whole basically a home brewery, and it's freaking me out because I don't know what the fuck I'm doing with this shit. So I'm looking at all this stainless steel, which looks great. I'm a photographer. I say, oh, this looks nice. Nice toys. How the fuck am I going to do this? And so, with a lot of research, joined a local brew club, just started brewing. And the first batch came out. It was exactly as predicted. It was horrible. It was watery and had no color and no flavor. But I always had this theory in the back of my head. It was like, well, if color is the issue and Maillard reactions are maybe the issue, then all right, just augment what you're missing from, which is just a slightly toasted portion of. That was always my theory. Okay, if you're missing the color, that can easily come from a small portion of roasted grain. And so I experimented pretty quickly with getting roasted grains at the right amount of roast and the right quantity, and getting it into the mash. And that worked pretty well. I decided to brew I don't know why. I kind of know why, but I started off with just doing a Kolsch, and I stuck to Kolsch. I like the idea of Kolsch because Kolsch is it's an ale that's treated like a lager, and I love that
Yeah.
hybridization and that sort of it's neither one nor the other, and it's unusual, and yet it was like a lager, and that also intrigued me. That was also going back to my core idea of doing a crafted lager, and to me, a Kolsch or a Helles felt more like a crafted lager than a traditional American, adjunct lager. So I went down the route of the Kolsch and using a little bit of roasted grain. It was like 2% of the total grain bill. And yeah, it started to work. It took a lot of experimenting, a lot of finessing, a lot of figuring out. It was a 4-step mash. But yeah, within a year, I'd got to that point of like, okay, this tastes, and I won 2 awards. I got a gold medal at this homebrew competition in Pennsylvania, and got a bronze medal at this really funny competition called the World Cup of Beer.
Okay.
Sounds really, really impressive, but it's a bunch of alcoholic pissheads in San Francisco. It's just their homebrew club, but they called it the World Cup of Beer.
Which looks
So
good on your marketing.
it sounds great. You've got a bronze at the World Cup of Beer for your Kolsch. So and I spoke to Charlie. I don't know if you know Charlie Bamforth. He was the chair emeritus at UC Davis in California. He was sort of the professor of brewing technology at UC Davis. He'd been everywhere. He'd had a 60-year career in brewing. He'd been at Fuller's. He was actually the head of research at AB InBev for a long time, or Anheuser-Busch. And I was losing a slight track of thought there. Oh, he'd been, I spoke to him, and he'd always said, listen, I don't know why anyone's not doing this process that you're doing, because it makes all the sense in the world. Sure, the flavors might be a bit different. If you're trying to copy a Stella Artois, you're going to run into problems. It won't taste exactly the same.
Yeah.
But otherwise, if you're going to go from scratch, you can create your own flavor profiles and have your own beers. And there's chemically, biologically, there's no reason why why this cannot be a great new way of brewing. So that was the two seals of approval were the awards, and then Charlie Bamforth, sort of agreeing.
Okay, so we can maybe come back to the actual process and how you're doing it now. But yeah, just focusing on that fact. I mean, it's almost a philosophical thing about, you know, the does does beer need malt? I mean, if you're German, then you've been told yes. I mean, that's one of the four core ingredients. But I mean, outside of Germany and what its influence, I mean, people have been brewing beer without malting for millennia. They've been. I mean, I only discovered this myself recently but if you think about it, I mean, sake is unmalted grain,
Mhm.
and most people would agree it's a beer. I mean, some people put it in its own category, but that. So all you're doing is, I mean, maybe for people who don't know, is when you malt, the enzymes within the grain turn the starch into sugar, and those enzymes are inside the grain, and you're just activating them. But there are plenty of ways of bringing, and people have been doing it for centuries, as I said, to bring enzymes from outside. And so this is not really, like I said, people might look at this as a kind of as an industrial process, but the principle is, it's not, there's nothing industrial about it. People have been doing it forever. So
Yeah, I think.
yeah, so in the philosophy, I mean, what you're doing is just getting the enzymes from a factory somewhere, but
Yeah.
the principle is exactly the same. That there's nothing strange about your process, really.
No. No, and I think what people forget is that I mean, I was just wanted to jump in on your point about millennia of brewing beer without malt. Also, and you had a great podcast about this. That in Africa they use spit, and the enzymes that exist in our spit also break down the starches into sugars. So yeah, to your point, there's been ways of making alcohol without using enzymes forever, including wine. You don't
Yeah,
use enzymes. You don't use malt in enzymes. It's just the yeast that exists on the skin of the grapes.
yeah,
And those particular yeasts are great at just breaking down the fructose in the grape.
yeah,
So yeah, to your point, but in the process that we're doing, what's slightly different is that barley, particularly barley, I mean, also all the grains, when you germinate them, the whole process of germinating is for the seed wants to grow into a plant. So that seed has some trace enzymes in it naturally, but really not that much. But when you put it in warm water and you let it germinate, it thinks it's going to grow. And I don't know the process of exactly what's happening chemically, but what happens is the plant suddenly kicks into gear and creates all these, massively increases the amount of enzymes that are there and these specific enzymes that it needs to turn that starch into sugar,
yeah,
different sugars as well. And those exact same enzymes that are being created by the seed, um, you know, are being created industrially, but they're based off of, like a lot of industrial processes, they're based off of a natural process. And so, in the same way that penicillin was created by fungi or bacteria sitting on the top of whatever his name was, petri dish, they've also discovered, I mean, enzymes weren't even discovered until fairly recently, but they've discovered that all sorts of different bacteria will excrete enzymes naturally, different types of enzymes. And so if you can find the right bacteria, or you can, and more recently they've been crossbreeding those bacteria to create the specific enzymes you need for, there's cancer treatments, there's beauty treatments, there's industrial processes for creating, you know, alcohol from corn. There's so many applications for enzymes, and as we know, enzymes are catalysts. They speed up these processes massively. And so, by choosing and finding the right bacteria, industrial enzyme producers can now produce these enzymes in these huge fermentation vats extremely efficiently, extremely cheaply. Because we don't need much. Like in brewing, we need a tiny, tiny, tiny little amount of enzyme liquid in our mash tun.
okay.
And the reason why this is more efficient and better than the malting process is because of the efficiencies in creating those enzymes. So it is a little bit like the electric car. And to your point, it's a natural process that's always existed. We can just produce it more efficiently now.
Yeah, because I was amazed, like when I looked at the UK Malting Society's figures, I mean, what I saw here is like for every 8,837 liters of beer, which I mean, we know the brewing process requires a minimum of that in water to be the beer, and then you need the cleaning and all of that. But there's an extra 5,000 liters of water that's just in malting. I mean,
Okay.
that blew
And
me
then
away on that figure. Like.
there's the CO2.
And then the CO2 and the electricity, yeah, they were saying like 900 kilowatts to make 8,000 liters of beer. And that is something you know brewing is water intensive and all that, but you never think of that side of it.
Yeah.
So do you have any idea, like, the kind of rule of thumb on how much more efficient the enzymes are?
Yeah, so in that study that was sponsored by Heineken, they found, and these are the numbers that I quote all the time, is that for a half a liter of beer that's served, we save 350 liters. Sorry, for a half liter, so 500 milliliters of beer that's served, we save 350 milliliters of water, so it's almost 2/3, and we save 16 grams of CO2. So that's per one can of beer, 16-ounce can of beer, or one pint.
Right.
And the last batch I did was 10,000 cans of, multiply that by 350 mil of water and 16 grams of CO2, and that's just on the malt. And
Yeah.
that's allowing for the cost, energy cost, and water cost of making those enzymes. That's what we come out as like our
Oh,
saving.
that's the saving. Sorry.
Yeah.
Wow, that is.
It's huge.
Yeah. And because these enzymes, I mean, down to just trying to run the company side of it, I mean, those enzymes then are also, I presume, an awful lot cheaper than the raw grain, or like the enzymes plus the raw grain are much cheaper than the malted grain.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And at the scale we're at now, we can't see those efficiencies just yet because we're also trying to use local grains. So we're speaking to local farmers who aren't necessarily if you're going for the bottom line macro, penny saving numbers, then you probably have to find much bigger supplies of grain, and you have to have that delivered directly in tractor trailers to your brewery, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not seeing the savings, but in theory, those savings are going to be huge, economic savings as well. And also allows you to use unusual grains. You don't have to use barley. We can use, there's a new grain coming out. I think it's called Xensa. I have to get the name of some brew. But it's a grain that, like grass, it grows back every year. So you don't have to till the soil for that grain.
Okay.
And so we want to use that grain because tilling the soil is really bad for the root systems of the soil, for the nitrogen, it releases CO2. There's a lot of issues with tilling the soil. So it allows us to go into areas of grain that have never been done before. I mean, or that we know of anyway.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because again, coming back to Africa, I mean, I've had a chat with there was two people. One is in Senegal, and he's brewing with a grain called fonio. But again, that cannot be malted. It's tiny, seemingly. So he just adds about 20% into his mash of malt, and it loves the flavors and everything it does. But that sounds like, if you came with raw enzymes, you could not malt it, but you could brew with that 100%.
Absolutely. You could do 100% corn beer. You could do 100% oats beer, 100% wheat.
Yeah. The other one that struck me is sorghum, because this comes back to what you're saying, like nearly all beers, even those brewed by the macros in Africa, have some degree of sorghum in them because it's the local grain. People like the flavor of that. But what I discovered is that they can only put 20% in there, because anything higher than 20%, there isn't enough enzymes in the sorghum. So they do malt it, but they can't, there aren't enough to make a whole batch. So then they actually do add enzymes seemingly in all the macros in the sorghum. The only one I know who doesn't do it is Kweza in Rwanda, and that's because they use a traditional malting process with banana ash, which presumably brings the enzymes in, So people are doing this, like you said, they are brewing with added enzymes. It's not a mystery. It's not, but they seem to be scared to tell people.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, all my research, not a single craft brewery or macro brewery mentions using enzymes ever. And we know that they are, because if you speak to the enzyme companies, which we did at length, they're selling a lot of enzymes.
Okay. It's so I mean, it is kind of a bit of a disjoint in your head because, like you're saying, you're basing your whole brewery on it, but then everyone else is so scared of being there. Why do you think they don't? Well, I guess you've answered the question. Why don't they promote it as a beer or as a method? But it's because they're scared of killing off their other beers, or
I think I mean, speaking to one of the biggest, the owners of one of the biggest distributors in New York City, beer distributors, he was interesting. I mean, he was like, he loved the idea, but he was skeptical. He's like, it's a fad. There was that beer called Toast. It's going to be a flash in the pan. You know, people don't really want to have sustainability and environmentalism shoved down their throats. They just want to relax and escape. It's a bit like the pornography analogy. You don't want someone quoting Shakespeare during a porn film. You just want, you want the escapism, and it's the same with alcohol. What's his point? It was that he didn't mention the porn. That was my.
okay.
I added that one in. No, but I get his point. It's like Friday night, you've had a long week, you're working class, you want to go and get hammered on a Friday night, watch a bit of football or rugby or whatever it is. You don't want someone there beating you over the head with sustainability and kind of on a crusade to make you feel good or bad about your drinking. You just want to drink. But at the same time, that's the same analogy with petrol cars in the 90s and 2000s. Oh yeah, electric. Oh, yeah, yeah. And then we'll get there at some point. But farmer Hank with his pickup truck is never going to want an electric pickup truck. And it's like suddenly it's like, oh dear, we were late to the party. So I think it's a cultural thing. I think it's historical. I think there's a fear factor. There's traditionalism. And I think they're just watching and see. They're waiting and seeing. We have to make this happen, and we're the first ones to really push that through.
Right.
And I think they're just waiting to see. I think give us 3 to 5 years, and if we've really established this as a thing and a brand and like an electric car, that it's actually quite normal and it makes all the environmental sense in the world, then I'm sure they'll change all their minds and their tunes.
Yeah. So, but I mean, does that mean like that it was important for you then to start with a beer style or close to a beer style that people actually knew, or why didn't you? Would it have been too much to go off, like you said, brewing with whatever this other grain you mentioned was like that nobody knew? So
Because I had no experience in brewing. Just getting a Kolsch was hard enough for me. So, and also, yeah, you're right. And to your point, I think it was okay proving this point and the same with Tesla, just like proving the point. Look, this doesn't have to look or feel any different from what you have. In fact, it's exactly the same as what you normally have, but it's just sustainable. That's all. In other words, it tastes, looks, and feels like a regular beer, but it's sustainable. And I worked in fashion my whole life doing photography, and it's like that was the same thing. It was so repetitive. Fashion. It was always like, oh, there is another trench coat. Wait, that's not exactly new, but it's got the collar's turned up on one side and down on the other. It's new. It's like it's groundbreaking. And there was an article about that in the New York Times. Is that as humans, the same in art. You don't, if you're shown something you can't recognize at all, you don't you find it hard to connect with it. So you want to see something that you kind of know that's just a little different, and then you think, oh, that's new. And that's, I think, was our approach. It's like, okay, it's exactly the same, just slightly different.
right.
And then eventually we do want to start experimenting with really unusual grains and therefore hopefully unusual flavors. I mean, right now we have a NIPA, which is, I don't know if that translates to anything. It's a Northeastern IPA, and they tend to be very fruity. So we have created this sort of juice bomb, like it's all the juiciness from the hops and without the bitterness. So we add sort of this malted extract at the very end to sort of soften off all that bitterness. So you get this really juicy, rich, hazy IPA. And that's going to be our next beer. So it's like a sort of a 180 of what we started out with to make the point that we can create also another type of very popular beer that's the polar opposite of a light lager, a very dense, heavy, rich, flavorful IPA. And then from there, I wanted to do a Helles, real beautiful, sulfury, velvety, rich Helles lager for early next year. And then in between all of that, then we want to start experimenting with different grains. Really see if we can do like 100% corn or this other. I forget. I'm gonna have to email you the name of that grain or this unusual grains and see how that tastes. And I'm
And
working with a master brewer actually. So I'm talking too much. Please carry on.
no, no, no. But I mean, yeah. So you've started at the moment. You just have the one beer with these planned. But that seems to be. I mean, you're selling in the greater. I'm not sure the exact area you're selling, but from what I'm seeing, like it seems to be wide. The people you're selling to are quite accepting it and like it for
Yeah.
itself, not for the sustainability.
Oh yeah, I live in Bed-Stuy, which is traditionally has been a very African American neighborhood. Biggie Smalls grew up here, Jay-Z, Mos Def, and the pub on my corner, run by Mike, is great. He loves it, and he's saying, and I'll go in there regularly and check up, and they're like, it's outselling Brooklyn Lager, it's outselling this. And I was like, and does anyone say anything about the sustainability? And the bartender's like, what sustainability? They just like the flavor. He didn't even know about the sustainability. It didn't register, or was it always of any importance to them? Not that they're ignorant, it's just that it wasn't important in terms of like
Yeah,
a
they
customer.
were just buying the local beer.
Yeah,
But then you obviously, like you said, you have that market or potential market where people are looking just for or they're not going to accept bad beer, but they're looking for something more sustainable. So you have that other angle
exactly.
that you can come in from.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me see. Yeah, because I had a quote there. I saw that in some article that there was some restaurant that said that the flavors were like freshly milled grains from their bakery. I don't know the restaurant itself, but it was in one of the articles. So is that at the moment what it is? Like they made it sound like it was much more grainy than the grains.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting restaurant. That's actually one of the first, if not the first, sort of pioneering restaurants to do farm to table.
Okay.
Blue Hill Farms, it's Blue Hill Stone Barn restaurant. It's
Yeah.
like a two-star restaurant in the up by Tarrytown, just north of New York City in Westchester. Dan Barber's, he's a really iconic chef in America. People fly like in their private jets to go and have a meal at this restaurant. It's insane. And the land is owned by the Vanderbilt family, and it's like a 16th century French farmhouse that was literally taken over stone by stone and rebuilt. It's beautiful. But they love the idea of the sustainability and the fact that it's all local ingredients. To them, that was really important. And to them, their menu for this season was a lot to do with grains. And yes, that batch that they had was the very first commercial batch, and it was slightly more grainy. We were adding the roasted malts, much more of it towards the end of the mash cycle, which did bring out that toastiness. And then the subsequent batches, we held that back a little bit, not massively, but just a little bit, so that it's a bit more bready and less toasty. So it's a bit softer, the grainness. But it's just like brewing anything else. You can, and that's the difference in a way between wine and beer, is that we, as brewers, can really take what we have in nature and create something else with it. That's the sort of beauty of it. So if it's a bit too sweet, or it's a bit too heavy, or it's too bitter, or it's too grainy, we can change those flavor notes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is something that struck me, that, again, for anybody who might have kind of objections to what seems like or an industrial thing of, enzymes. But I mean, even craft brewers are doing this all the time with water, and I mean, they completely change water profiles from time to time. It's not something that is a mystery to anybody in brewing. They're all doing it, but just not with that. But I mean, even the malt, just to come back to the malt, I mean, maybe this is an advantage or a disadvantage. I mean, the advantage, like you said, is you, apart from the sustainability and your ability to use new types of grains. But I mean, malting, they they can adapt the flavor with that, when they're malting, and you have different types of malts, and you have for different beers. So how, like, does that mean that there are certain beers you will not be able to do that maybe with malt they can make? Or
No, it's exactly the same. I mean, your base malt in almost all beers, your base malt is a lightly. It's basically you. So once it germinates, once the seed is germinating and it's still moist, you chuck it into an oven to dry it and to halt the germination process. And then so your base malt is not really hasn't had any Maillard reactions, and it hasn't really been cooked per se. So all the additional grains that you're talking about, so like crystal malts and chocolate malts and all those things, they go in very small quantities. And what they've done is they've taken that base malt and then they've roasted it to different levels of roast.
Okay.
That's pretty much it.
And you
And
can
so we can do the exact same thing. So if we want like a Guinness, like a really dark, black style stout, we can just take a small percentage of unmalted grain and roast it till it's almost black if we want to, and anything in between that. I mean, to be honest, I haven't actually experimented with all the other flavor profiles, but it doesn't seem like you wouldn't be able to do that in my mind. Because don't forget, a lot of it's also in the hops. I mean, how much of the beer flavor is coming from the malt and how much is coming from the hops and the yeast. Those are three different. These are all three factors are playing in there. But from the chemical analysis, I don't see why, for any reason, why you can't, with the enzymes and the raw grain, achieve all the amounts of sugars and styles of sugars. So you create all the maltose, sucrose, fructose that you need, and the coloration is going to come from whether you roast heavily or not, a certain percentage of that grain. And then and then beyond that, it's the type of hops, it's the type of yeast, and the way you ferment it.
Yeah, and the water profile as well.
And the water profile, absolutely, yeah.
So, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. There was some question I was going to ask you about that. What did I have here? Yeah, so if you're brewing this, sorry, I'm still trying to get my train of thought back here for 1 second.
Go look at it.
Yeah, so like so the malt is the same. You can do the roasting. You can do all of that. Oh yeah, that was my question. The flavor. I mean, malt. A lot of people say it doesn't carry the terroir, but it actually does, even through the malting process. I would presume, like you're talking about local ingredients all the time there, that you could have that terroir, that local, feeling, that local taste will be much more pronounced in a local raw grain than it would be in a malt. So you would, if you're doing that, you would have very much a very local beer.
Yep. Yeah, and that is our goal. I think as part of the idea of being sustainable is to try wherever possible, and because we can use almost any grain. I mean, that's a big difference. Malting houses it's very critical how you malt your grain, and therefore what grain you receive at the malting house. Like if your grain is too thin or too fat, the malting there will be too little or too few or too many enzymes, and you want to have a consistent amount of enzymes in your malting process, because it can throw off the brewers, because they're trusting in you, the malting house, to create a product that has enough enzymes to do the job you need to do. For us, we could take a very underdeveloped grain or over, and there was a very thin, spindly little grain that had a really bad season, or where there was too much rain and the grain is super fat and chunky. And yes, and to your point, as a terroir, if the grains naturally are of a certain, they're grown in a certain way because of the rainfall patterns and the the sunlight and dry patterns, we can use it, and we can use those. We can enhance those. We can bring those flavors out and even make a point of it. In other words, for each season, it's going to be slightly different because that is nature. If your grains come in a bit underdeveloped or overdeveloped, there is a slight shift in flavor, and we would want to embrace that in the same way that the craft industry has.
Yeah, because that's what I was thinking of. Is I had a chat with Waterford Distillery just earlier in the year, last year, and they're basically pioneering this in whiskey, and they produce whiskies with grain from particular fields. I mean, they can tell you which field it came from, and that seems a very fascinating thing that you could do with your method that you're not going to be able to with the malting house unless you keep the malt somehow separately, which adds a huge cost. Like you'd have to have a whole process, but they're just combining everything. So this is something you could do with enzymes that it's not otherwise possible, And
also instead of forcing.
Sorry.
Well, instead of grain farmers feeling forced to grow a type of grain in Africa, trying to grow barley when it doesn't grow there naturally, only because they want to produce beer, you could produce other grains or use almost any other grain. I mean, sorghum is a good example. There are other grains too that you can maybe experiment with that are even more water efficient. And um,
And people are willing to try now. I think not even the Oakland, but people are willing to try the different tastes. They're looking. I mean, geez, you just have to look at craft beer now. Like they all have to be producing a new taste every week. So people are searching out something new.
yeah, yeah,
And that
absolutely.
seems like something you can do, like you said, with different grains, different you have different flavors from everything. It sounds like this should appeal to craft brewers and craft beer drinkers, like on a huge level.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I'm finding as I'm going around and also within the homebrew club is that, no, actually more, less the homebrew club, but more the master brewers and professional brewers, there is so much at stake financially that they don't like to really take big risks. If you're, with our process, the first batch we brewed, we had to dump it at scale.
Okay.
Even though we were working with a really uh, sophisticated master brewer who's now consulting for us all the time, who's helping us develop all these new recipes and trying to increase efficiencies in the mash because we're using four-step mash. We're trying to find ways to pre-gelatinize the grain, to speed up the mash. But so we dumped the first batch. The second batch was almost there. So we had to dump that as well. And so by the time we got to market, it was our third or fourth batch. Not many brewers really want to take that amount of time and risk and potential failure on something. So they tend to want to use what they know. And all the recipes that exist out there all rely on malt. All them, you're using X amount of grain, X amount of this, you're doing this amount of mash. That's all known for malt. It's unknown for barley. So
Right.
I think that scares a lot of people off that it's so, you're walking into kind of a black hole in a way.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned there the four-step process. So what is your actual process? So when you're brewing on a day-to-day basis, is it?
It's exactly the same. The only difference is right now is that so traditionally American craft brewing, they use, and even the macro breweries, they use single infusion mashes, meaning you just get your water, whatever your strike temperature is, 145 Fahrenheit, you chuckle your grain in, you mix it up, you lauter it, and then you boil it. Whereas the German brewers traditionally always did step mashes, and that was because the malt was less attenuated, it had less enzymes, and so you had to be more careful about how you mashed to maximize out the amount of sugars you got out. And so with our process, the enzymes that we're using, they are very delicate. They're more delicate than traditional than the current malted enzymes. So we have to do a four-step mash, which is slow and just takes time. It's not much more energy heavy because once that mash tun is up to temperature, that's the majority of your energy usage. Keeping it at temperature for a bit longer is a very minimal increase in energy. We do want to change that. We want to get it down to a similar mash time as they do with a single mash infusion. But so that's the only caveat to our process is the four-step mash. Other than that, it's exactly the same. And there are still many breweries that do multiple step mashes. It's not a multiple step mash is not unusual.
Yeah, and it's a lot obviously in Germany still, and Czech Republic and all of that. I mean,
Yeah,
like you said, it's not unusual, but it is probably for America. Yeah, it's somewhat unusual.
yeah, because craft breweries haven't up until recently haven't done a lot of traditional lagers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the other part where you're probably ahead of the curve, because I think lagers are becoming more popular again. People are beginning to see, yeah, getting tired of all the IPAs. I think wanting some variety. I have myself, so I'll just speak for myself. Um, so this is, like you said, I mean, it's for your scale at the moment. There's no cost savings for you here, but for as you scale up and you have different beers, that you hope you'll see some cost savings on it and cost efficiencies.
Yeah.
Does this mean that, I'm just thinking out loud here, but for the farmer, I mean, this is also a potential for them to sell the grain
Yep.
probably at
Direct.
a higher value because you're cutting out the malter and directly to the brewer. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how that's going to pan out. That was always the original idea. Was that, oh, this could be great for the farmers because we don't have to be as critical as a malting house. Like I said, we can use an under attenuated grain or over attenuated, or and so for us, that would make it easier for a farmer to not have to lose as much grain because it didn't grow properly in that season due to the weather. Um, but we'll see. I mean, the grain still has to be cleaned. You can't have filthy grain. You can't have dirty grain. And one thing the malting house does do is clean the grain really well as part of that process. And so there will still be some elements that a malting house has done traditionally that we might still need to be done. But some of the grain farmers I'm speaking to can and do sometimes even prepare the grain for the malting house. So they do clean it. They do take out all the debris and everything. So yeah, maybe it is a way to save money not to save money, but a way for farmers to maybe increase slightly their income.
No, it's like I said, I think that's pretty much all the questions I came in with. But it's a fascinating kind of subject, and I don't know where to. I kind of don't want to leave it now, but where are you going with it? Where like you said, now you have your first beer out. It's been pretty well received by the people who have it. How do you expand, or are you happy with where you are, or like do you want to become that big conglomerate that macro known the Tesla of beer?
No, and not in a corporate way. No, we would like to be bigger because it would the efficiencies get better, and so in terms of sustainability, it makes more sense to have a higher volume, right, than keeping it too small. But we do want to expand in terms of like flavors and experiment. I just love the idea of continuously experimenting with efficiency, with flavor, with grains. I mean, also my son he just got a master's in sustainability, and it was interesting. We've had a lot of debates about sustainability in the sense that, there's always been this argument of anti-biotech, anti-CRISPR, gene editing, particularly in sustainability and environmental causes. But now there is a trend to look at that in a more nuanced way. And so, for instance, if you're trying to grow crops in sub-Saharan Africa, or even in California, where there are major water shortages, you do have to start entertaining things like, okay, well, if we can modify a grain or any plant to grow with requiring half the amount of water, why wouldn't we look into that? And so all of those things I find really exciting. And whether we become huge or just mid-sized or small, I don't think, economically we can survive just being a very small, tiny contract brewing operation. But if we can get to a size that we can survive at, I think that's the goal. I mean, getting bigger than that, I don't know. I think it's pretty. Just becomes a whole other thing that I don't think I've really. I don't know. I don't have the skill set for that. I don't think I have the interest in it. I think that's something for somebody else if they wanted to. I would rather see that the technology takes off and becomes more normalized. If we can get to a mid-size brewery, and the technology is accepted and it's a thing that's moving forward, and people have the same desire to try completely new ways out, and it can save a lot of water and energy. That would be our goal.
Actually, just on the phrasing you've chosen for it, I mean, you're advertising it as a raw beer. I thought that was one. It was interesting. It was also a bit confusing for me because anytime I'd heard raw beer mentioned before, it was unboiled.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
So to me, but I guess, I mean, there's another thing to play with. You make it truly raw with your raw barley and don't boil it. I mean, you have a huge potential there to experiment as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. Yes, I mean yeah.
Ultra raw. But so what would you say to anyone like, first of all, most people can't taste this because you're only in New York, and so we just have to assume that it tastes exactly like a Kolsch, and it's really nice, and it has enough reviews and awards to back that up. So, but what you say to anyone who would, so maybe leaving out the end customer, most of whom cannot get it, but what would you say to a brewer who wanted to try this? I mean, is there anything that you would encourage them to try or not? That any lessons learned that they should avoid?
Yeah, I mean, the grist size is very important, but that's pretty standard with most brewing. But again goes back to a tradition because it's a raw grain and it's not a malted grain. It's much harder. And there's been a lot of fear about, oh my God, you've got to adjust, you've got to have a special mill to do this. And it's like, well, if you're going to make flour from unmalted wheat, you need a particular type of what do you call that, mill. So it's not that complicated. So, but that's been a factor I've read a lot of about. So, oh yeah, the grist is going to be a problem. And it's like, no, the grist is, you just got to get the grist, powdery. And if you're going to go for a powdery grist, you also have to make sure for lautering that what we're using right now is we're using a mash mixer and a mash press filter. So that means we don't have to worry about a stuck mash as much. They're pretty standard as brewing systems, but they're not ubiquitous by any means. Again, craft breweries tend to use single infusion mash tuns and they lauter. And so that can be problematic for those types of breweries. But there's ways around that. I mean, I was brewing at home with a regular, mash tun and I was lautering it. And I was not getting stuck mash. I was using, rice kernels, which is a standard thing to do to stop your mash getting stuck. But I did get a few stuck mashes. So on that side of things, yeah, you've got to watch out for those basic things. And then,
where would they get the enzymes? Like, are there specific? You mentioned that like these were pretty much off the shelf enzymes, but where is there a catalog that specifies just that these are great for beer, or how did you find them? How would anyone else find them?
If you just Google brewing beer without using malt, I think so. There are multiple different companies that sell them. I think, is it Murphy's? There's an Irish one. I think it's called Murphy's that sell a bunch of these enzymes. Then there's, what's that French one? And there's Novozymes. So there's like 3 or 4 companies that sell these enzymes. And there are Chinese ripoffs. You can buy the individual enzymes, create your own cocktails. I mean, any master brewer will know which enzymes are needed for each of the different steps in the mash.
Okay.
So it's really not that hard.
Right. It's just basically, excuse me, just basically go out and experiment. But again, like you said, you may end up throwing away a lot. So that's going to put a lot of people off.
Yeah. But, as with all experimenting, you use what do they call that? A test batch, a smaller brew system. What do they call it? A test system, or there's a name for that. A smaller brew system. Like instead of 20 barrels, you're going to do like a 1 barrel.
Yeah, the pilot system. Yeah.
Pilot system. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure, it's like any experimenting, you're gonna make a few mistakes and
have a bit of fun with it.
Have some fun with it. Yeah, it's good. I think the possibilities are quite big.
Yeah. Okay. Well, listen. I hope when people watch this that they'll get they'll get encouraged. I mean, I know I want to try some now just to see. One, I want to try the ones that are trying to be something like an existing beer, but yeah, I'd love to try some of these other ones that you're suggesting are possible, like the ones with different grains and what flavors can come out. Because, well, as far as I can see it, I mean, if people are putting lactose in beer, then I definitely not against having enzymes in it.
No, because the enzymes are there anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas lactose is not. Okay, listen, John, it was fascinating. I know when I leave this now, I'm going to suddenly think of about 5, 6, 7 questions that I wish I'd asked you, but maybe another time. If I come up with enough, maybe another time, and you can maybe when your IPAs come out and that we can chat again and see how they're going. But and definitely if some of your experiments with new grains come out, I'd love to talk about that. But other than that, thanks a million for your time. It was very interesting and educational as well.
Thank you, Brian. Really, really appreciate it. Send me your address and I'll send you a couple of beers.
All right. Okay, I'll take you up on that one. So, all right. Listen, I'm just going to play out a video here, and thanks again, John. It was fascinating. I hope it seems like it's been very well received. I hope it's the start of something that takes off, because just on the sustainability alone, it's if you can save like that, have whatever it was 350 mils of water for every 500 mils of beer. I mean, that is a lot. Okay, let's see you. Bye.